Hi, this is Reverend Judy Copeland, pastor of the Hancock Congregational Church. I think sometimes we assume that some people are just born kind, that it's in their DNA, that, you either have kindness within you or you don't. Some people just seem to know how to bend down and address a forgotten child at eye level and make them feel like the center of the universe. And, I'm not talking just about the pretty children or the winsome ones or the daring ones, the children with natural charisma that we all relate to, but the plodding ones and the clumsy ones and the wary ones, the ones who just seem ill at ease. Some adults just have a knack for that kind of kindness. They are naturally kind. But what about the rest of us? And that's our topic for today, kindness. More specifically, what does it take to be kind? Is it a matter of nature or nurture? Are some people simply born kind, born with a propensity, a sixth sense for smoothing the way for others? Or is kindness something we have to train ourselves to be or do, so like riding a bicycle or learning to make a good pie crust or learning to type, or in a younger generation, learning to code? What does it take to be kind? So we turn first, of course, to the Bible. And in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, there is one of the key passages on kindness comes from Micah chapter 6, verse 8, and it goes like this. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. One of my Sunday school teachers back in the day wanted to make sure that we would always be able to find that passage. And so what he told us was that we were to think of this passage from Micah as a tall passage. A tall passage, that's what he called it. He said, think of a basketball player, a 6'8" basketball player. And that, if you remember that 6'8", it will take you to Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where we have that wonderful passage about kindness. Now, of course, there's more to that passage. It also talks about justice and humility, and we're going to save those two topics for another day. But first, before we get into more specific discussion about kindness, let's talk a little bit about Micah. Micah was one of the minor prophets of the Old Testament. There are 12 of them, and they're what being a minor prophet means is just meant that you were one of the more short-winded ones. The minor prophets, their books of the Bible, are only, most of them are just a few chapters long. And Micah lived at the time of Isaiah, who was indeed one of the more long-winded prophets of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and they were contemporaries. And there had been decades of peace and prosperity, but by the turn of the 8th century BCE, things were beginning to change. Jerusalem had rebelled against Assyria, the international giant of the day, and the Assyrians were in a mood to retaliate. King Hezekiah, one of the good kings who will turn up in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew's Gospel, did his best to hold off the enemy, and to a certain extent he did. He held on to Jerusalem, but he lost control of some 36 hilltop towns, including Bethlehem, and ultimately Hezekiah ruled over a much diminished kingdom. Micah and Isaiah were witnesses to this time of national upheaval, and much of what they have to say, the gist of their prophetic message, is about reclaiming the promises of God in this radically altered set of circumstances. They will try to recenter hope about the way in which God works, reminding the people of Israel who are watching the powerful fight things out on the world stage, that hope may come from unexpected and unlikely places, even a backwater town like Bethlehem, says Micah. Micah was a rural prophet. He didn't write or offer his dispatches from Jerusalem, but rather from the margins, the place where the heartbreak of the 8th century, where the violent sweep of the Assyrians was perhaps felt most acutely. And his perspective was always to try and get the people to return to God, to get back to basics, to remember the values and character attributes and the kind of devotion that had once made them a great nation. What does God require of you? These three things: that you do justice, that you love kindness, and that you walk humbly before God. Kindness, or the Hebrew word in Hebrew, the word is hesed, is sometimes translated as mercy, sometimes as loving kindness, sometimes as steadfast love. And the fact that there's no consensus among translators perhaps tells us that this is one of those words that is bigger and more all-encompassing in Hebrew than any single word we may have for it in English, which is why sometimes kindness is expressed as loving kindness, and that's as a single word, no space between the loving and the kindness. Loving kindness. What does the Lord require of you? Not just kindness, but kindness amped up to loving kindness. There is, of course, in our own day, good science to back up the benefits of practicing loving kindness. Not only is it pleasing to God, but many would say kindness is also pleasing to our own good health. Researchers at the University of Columbia tell us that it can help with anxiety, documenting how participants in a study who engaged in kind acts displayed significant increases in positive affect, and that these, and this is probably what's even more important, that these were sustained over time. David Hamilton, who was for many years an organic chemist working at pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs to fight cancer and cardiovascular disease, and who now writes extensively about the health benefits of kindness, traces several ways that kindness impacts our bodies and our brains. Acts of kindness, he says, are often accompanied by emotional warmth, and emotional warmth produces the hormone oxytocin in the brain and throughout the body, which in turn causes the release of a chemical that dilates the blood vessels and reduces blood pressure, and therefore protects the heart. Thus, kindness is said to be, and I love this word, cardioprotective. Kindness has also been linked to reduced inflammation in the body, that inflammation that can do everything from making our joints hurt to aging us prematurely. Kindness makes us feel good. It gives us what they sometimes call the helper's high, or as the Pulitzer Prize winning science writer Natalie Anger sums it up, scientists have discovered that the small, brave act of cooperating with another person, of choosing trust over cynicism, generosity over selfishness, makes the brain light up with quiet joy. So God requires of us loving kindness, and science chimes in and tells us that this is a good thing. But how do we go about doing it? How do we practice loving kindness if we are not one of those people for whom it just seems to come naturally? So this morning, here are a couple of suggestions for practicing kindness. First of all, most acts of kindness begin with acts of noticing. To be kind, you first have to pay attention. Now, this can mean slowing things down a little, or it can mean looking in places where you have not looked before. Do you notice when people could use a helping hand? Kindness begins by paying attention, by making it a priority to notice what others are experiencing. And secondly, it's okay to start small. If you stop and think about the people who would be universally acknowledged as kind, what comes to mind when we think about these people or when we talk about these people is that their kindness is almost always rendered in the currency of small things. The cookies they baked, the cards they wrote, the casseroles they delivered, the way they didn't rush off but stopped to, dig into a conversation just when someone really needed a little picking up. Small steps are the easiest, of course, to take, but they build habits of attention, caring, and reacting that can shape us into kinder, more wholehearted people. Sometimes small acts of kindness, of course, lead to great acts of courage. There is a special class of heroes recognized at the Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem, a section dedicated to Gentiles known as the righteous of the nations, non-Jews who exercised extraordinary behavior during those dark, dark times. And for many of these righteous of the nations, it all began with something relatively small, a relatively minor act of charity, a potential helper initially deciding to help just one person, just one time with a meal or maybe a single night's lodgings. But then as the deportations got underway, these small acts of kindness sometimes grew into something bigger and bolder. In 1940, a boy who had been wandering on the streets of Warsaw for 3 days without food or shelter decided in desperation that he was going to approach the first person who came his way, whoever it was. And it turned out it was Władysław Kowalski, a retired colonel in the Polish army, who was working at the time for a Dutch-based electronics firm in Warsaw. And he decided to give the boy a meal, and of course a meal turned into a night's stay and eventually into new identity papers and a new home, a job. And from then on, from his first contact with this boy, Kowalski decided that he was going to help the Jews as much as possible. He was able to exploit the freedom of movement he had in conjunction with his position in a foreign firm, and he was able to smuggle some Jews out of the Warsaw Ghetto, as well as smuggle building materials in suitcases. And eventually he threw his own lot in with 49 Jews, going into an underground bunker with them and staying hidden with them for over 100 days. Either we'll all survive or none of us will, he told them when they pressed him to flee for his own safety. He is today credited with saving 49 lives while putting his own at great peril. But it all began with finding a piece of bread for a glassy-eyed boy who came up to him in the streets of Warsaw. Loving kindness doesn't have to start off grand. It doesn't require a master plan. So very often it starts with the smallest of gestures. It just asks us to pay attention, to look for that small crack in the universe where we can make a start. Because that's how we begin to shape our lives according to the tall but worthy mandate we find in Micah 6:8. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly before God? Our faith asks us not just to imagine, but to act on behalf of a world where justice, kindness, and humility rule. We have a long, long, long way to go, but it begins with the actions that we choose to take, the kindness that you and I will make it a point to exercise starting right now. In Jesus' name, amen. Our hymn this morning, sung to a spirited American folk tune called Nettleton, opens with the lines, "Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace," which is what faith at its best helps us to do, to put our hearts in tune with something and someone greater than ourselves. Come thou fount of every blessing.